willingness to share. Thank you, and bless him for his willingness to study and prepare. Bless us all with hearts to hear what you have to say this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Just a minute here. Alrighty, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, if you've been here, you know that I'm going through the book of Hebrews. This is my fourth sermon on Hebrews. So, theme of Hebrews. Well, before I get into Hebrews, I'll say this. I'm preaching through the book of Hebrews. My goal is to give you an overview so that you kind of understand what the book of Hebrews is about. My goal is not to pick through each individual verse and give you the Greek meaning behind all the words and all that. I'm not quite trained to do all that stuff, but I've divided the book of Hebrews into 5 sermons, so kind of giving you a broad overview. In doing that, I kind of end up skipping a bunch of really good verses that could be studied in detail, and there's some sections where you could preach a whole sermon on one verse. So that's not my intention. So but to give you an overview, and then if you go to study the book of Hebrews more in detail, you kind of have an idea of what it's about. The theme of the book of Hebrews is that Jesus is better. So I'm going to go back and do a little bit of review about what we talked about already. So the problem that we see in the book of Hebrews is that there were Jewish believers who were facing persecution. We don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. We don't know who he wrote to, but we do know they were Jewish believers. Many of them were either holding on to some of their old Jewish traditions, or perhaps they were even thinking about just leaving Christ altogether and going back to live under the old law, just because of the persecution they were facing as Christ followers. So the Old Covenant was very ingrained into the Jewish people for thousands of years, and when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, their Old Covenant, all their sacrifices, all the temple, the tabernacle, their diet, everything changed, became obsolete. So it's not like this old system was wrong. In fact, it was a picture of what was to come. It wasn't wrong, but the new was far better. When you have a picture of something, the real thing is much better than just the picture. So the new covenant was much better. And Hebrews was written to these Jewish believers to remind them that the new covenant, and specifically Jesus, was far better than the old covenant. So this is kind of a brief outline. The book of Hebrews divides up pretty easily into 5 sections, which is how I'm preaching through it. So the first sermon I preached on Hebrews, we looked at how Jesus is better than angels and how Jesus is better than the law. So it's kind of common sense to us that, of course, Jesus is better than angels, but to the Jewish believers, they held angels in very high regard because they believed that the angels brought the law to Moses. So they held angels up there pretty high. So it wasn't just common sense necessarily that Jesus was better than angels. Then in each section you will find a warning that the author gives, and the warning in this first section is that do not reject salvation, because if the law that the angels gave, if you get punished for disobeying the law that the angels gave, how much more severe will your punishment be if you reject the covenant that Jesus brought? The second sermon was on chapters 3 and 4, how Jesus was better than Moses in the Promised Land. Moses was held in very high regard by the Jewish leaders, by all the Jews, sorry, not just the Jewish leaders. And then we looked at some of the similarities and differences between Jesus and Moses. Moses was a picture of Jesus in the Old Testament. He established a covenant, and then we see in chapter 4 how he offered a rest. The rest then was the Promised Land. Our rest, of course, is heaven. And I'll just skip down to the warning there. The warning is mostly in chapter 4. Do not harden your hearts. The way the Jews hardened their hearts before they went into the Promised Land, and therefore they could not enter the Promised Land. It's a strong warning about unbelief, the lack of faith, and how instruction for us to fully believe in Jesus so that we can enter heaven someday. Chapters 5 through 7 is what I preached on about 5 weeks ago. There limited attendance here that Sunday because of the snow, which was fine. We looked at how Jesus was better than the priests. So, the priestly system was a picture of what was to come, and Jesus is our great high priest. So we looked at how Aaron, the tribe of Levi, they were the priests. We looked at kind of how the sacrifices worked a little bit, daily and yearly. I don't think I'm going to go through all these details, but lots of similarities between Jesus and the priests, and then also differences. We're gonna get into some of that today. Anyway, those were the prior 3 sermons. Just a brief overview. Today we're going to look at chapters 8 through 10. So if you want to open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 8. I'm not going to necessarily read any specific section. I will be jumping around and reading certain verses. So in this section, we see how Jesus is better than the old covenant, or a different way of saying it is the covenant that Jesus brought. The new covenant is better than the old covenant. So some of the Jewish traditions that speak to this, they have the tabernacle. Tabernacle was their temporary temple that they had when they were in the wilderness between Egypt and the Promised Land. They had the tabernacle. And the temple was obviously the permanent place of worship. And also in this, with Jesus being the high priest and Jesus bringing this new covenant, they're very similar. So a lot of things will overlap with this sermon and last sermon. So the sacrifices, there was a daily sacrifice, so every day the priest would offer a sacrifice for the sins of the people. And then once a year on the Day of Atonement, there was a yearly sacrifice that the high priest went into the Holy of Holies with blood on the Day of Atonement. That was a yearly sacrifice. So there were some similarities, obviously, between, I'm going to talk more about that later, so I'm not going to get into all those right this second. There are similarities between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and there are even more differences. And we will get into all those in more detail. We will also look at the warning that is offered in chapter 10. And then just some certain sections of verses there that kind of highlights from this section of chapters. All right, 2 things that are very important to remember. Jesus brought a better covenant. The new covenant Jesus brought is much better than the old covenant. So that's number one that you got to remember this morning. The second thing that's going to help you in remembering this morning is that the old covenant, the priests, the temple, the sacrifices, all those things, the old covenant was a picture of what was to come. So think of the old system as a picture, and think of Jesus and the new covenant as the real thing. That helps you understand the book of Hebrews. All right, so this section of mostly the beginning of chapter 9, but either way, Hebrews talks a lot about the tabernacle and the temple. So this is kind of a picture of maybe how the tabernacle looked, in the wilderness. This was their tent. This was the one they could tear down and move and take to another place. This was the temporary one before they actually had a temple. So you kind of see they had the gate, the fence out around, whatever they called it. And then there was like the outside court. They would have outside altar. They would have had, I think, a big wash basin. I don't see it there. And then the inside. I'll show you a picture of the inside here. So inside you had the bigger room on your right is the holy place. This is where they would have offered their daily sacrifices. The table there would have been where the showbread was. You see the lampstand that always had to be burning, never stopped. And then the altar. Okay? And then the smaller room where you see the Ark of the Covenant with the long poles for handles. That curtain, it's a cutaway, so that curtain in front of it, where's my laser? This curtain would have come the whole way across here. It's a cutout. But that place in there, that was called the Holy of Holies. And the only person allowed in there was the high priest, and he could only go in once a year. And what I'm told is that they tied a rope around his ankle, just in case he didn't do something quite right, so that they could pull him out if he was struck dead. Very serious, right? A little scary to think about, and almost humorous, but we would never think of it, being scared to go into God's house, in case, for the fear of being struck dead. That's a foreign concept to us, but that was, it was very real to them. This altar here is where they did the daily sacrifices, and then once a year, the high priest would go into this section. This is all a picture of, what was to come, of Jesus, Jesus' sacrifice for us, and we'll get into that a little more, sorry. So that was the tabernacle. This is kind of a picture of Solomon's temple. This was more the permanent one, not the one they had to take down and cart around. But there again, you see the priest standing in there offering the sacrifice. And then you see those lion-looking things with the wings. Those are the cherubims, and that was the Holy of Holies. Again, only going in there once a year. So if you're reading these chapters 8 through 10, they talk a lot about that sacrificial system, the tabernacle, and everything. So there were similarities between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Interestingly enough, when I was studying, couldn't really find too many similarities, but there were a few. First of all, obviously, there was a covenant, right? Just going to read the verses that are listed here. Hebrews 8, 6 and 7. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediated is better, which is enacted on better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. So it kind of states the obvious. This old one was a picture of the new, And if the old system, the old tabernacle, the old temple, sacrifices for animals, if that was good enough, we wouldn't have needed a new covenant. The second similarity is that there's a temple and a sanctuary. So the beginning of chapter 9, I'm not going to take the time to read all those verses, but it talks about how there was the temple, the holy place, the sanctuary. But it also talks about the sanctuary being in heaven. Jesus, as our high priest, didn't enter into the sanctuary in the temple. He didn't offer himself on the altar in the temple. This was a heavenly thing. This temple is a picture of what happened for real in heaven. So yes, there was a temple, there was a sanctuary, but the new temple, the new sanctuary, are the real ones. And then there was also sacrifices. There was blood that had to be shed for the covering of sin. However, it was, instead of the animal sacrifices, it was Jesus' sacrifice, which we will get into. You see the list of differences, much longer than the list of similarities. So temporary versus permanent. The old covenant was temporary. It did last several thousand years, but it was still just a picture of what was to come. Chapter 8, verse 5 says, "They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, 'See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you in the mountain.'" So, of course, Moses went up to Mount Sinai and got instructions from God on how to make this tabernacle. But yet it was only a picture of what was to come. And Jesus brought something that's permanent. A better ministry, a better covenant. I already read those verses, chapter 8, verses 6 and 7. Jesus brought something better. And if the first covenant had been good enough, Jesus would have had to bring a second one. But he did. He brought a second one for us because we were in desperate need of it. External versus internal. So I did talk a little bit about this last time. The sacrifices that they offered on the altar, or the altars in the temple and the tabernacle. An animal, simply killing an animal, a sheep, let's say, and dumping its blood out. That doesn't necessarily do anything for me. That's what God asked the people to do, to cover sins, but it was all external. It really did nothing for a conscience. So David, since you're sitting in the front, I'm going to pick on you today. If I were the high priest and you brought your sheep to me, and I killed it for you, just because we spilled the blood of the sheep does not mean that it totally cleared your conscience. That's what God asked them to do for temporarily, but that poor sheep's blood really didn't clear your conscience of anything. It's just kind of an external practice until the real thing could come. Chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. These verses were quoted from Jeremiah. I'll just read them here. "For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they all shall know me, from the least to the greatest." So God's saying, it's not going to be external. It's not just going to be a practice. I'm going to put it in your mind and put it in your heart. It's going to be something internal, not merely an outward practice. Another difference is animal blood versus Jesus' blood. Just a few verses speaking to this. Hebrews 10, verse 10. That's verse 11, isn't it? It says, and every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sin. All those animal sacrifices can't take away sin. But chapter 9, verses 13 through 15 say this. Forth the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of an heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So if the animal blood was good enough for a little bit, how much more better is Jesus' blood for us? It's just infinitely better. We can't even compare it. We also talked about this briefly already. How there was an earthly sanctuary and a heavenly sanctuary. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. I think that's a beautiful verse. Let me just read it again. For Christ has not entered into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. So David, when you brought your lamb to me, and I sacrificed it for you, I would take it to the altar, and I would pray to God. I said, God, please forgive David of his sin. Here's a sacrifice for David's sin. The way God had it set up in the Old Testament is, if I was a priest, you all had to come to me. You couldn't just go to God and ask God for forgiveness. That's not how it worked. You had to come through me because I was the mediator between you and God, right? So that was my job. If I were the high priest, not even just the high priest, there were many priests. That was my job, to go to God on your behalf. And we see that Jesus, I think it's a beautiful picture. Jesus did not enter into the holy place made with hands, but he entered into heaven itself to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Jesus is now that mediator. So yes, we can all come to God, but we're all going through Jesus. We're all going through Jesus, just like all the people in the Old Testament had to go through the priest. The next difference is the number of sacrifices that they have to make. So, I don't know, throughout the thousands of years, there must have been millions of animals that they killed. There were certain feasts that they would just kill thousands of animals. And even on the Passover, during Jesus' time, they would kill hundreds of thousands of lambs. Countless sacrifices. Going to read, countless sacrifices versus Jesus' one sacrifice. Going to read chapter 9, verses 25 and 26. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood not his own. For then Jesus would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. And the common sense there is that he didn't have to, he only had to once. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So countless, endless sacrifices, blood everywhere, all the time, every day. And then Jesus came with one sacrifice. And it was just like, boom. That was it. That's the only one we needed, right? Infinitely better. The other difference, the last difference I have here, and if you were to search through this, you could probably find more differences than what I'm looking at this morning. But the last one that we're going to look at is that in the Old Covenant, there was a reminder of sin versus in the New Covenant, it's freedom from sin. I'm going to pick on David one more time. When David brings his sheep to me, I sacrifice it for him. I pray to God for him. Whenever David sins, he has to bring a sacrifice every time he sins. Instead of being free from sin, that sacrifice, rather than removing his sin, it just reminds him of it. Every day they would bring a sacrifice, and every day they were reminded of how sinful they were. And that, we need forgiveness every day. And that's true, we do too, right? However, it was like, hey, kill the sheep again. I'm so tired of sinning. Kill the sheep every day. You get tired of it, right? It's just a constant reminder of their sinfulness. Go read chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. For since the law was but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of those realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? If that sacrifice actually took away sin, they could have just stopped sacrificing because their sins were gone, right? Having once been cleansed, they would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year, or every day, however you want to look at it. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. So there's a reminder of sin constantly in the Old Testament. However, in the Old Covenant, in the New Covenant, we see freedom from sin. I'll read verses 13 and 14 from chapter 9. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? It's an eternal thing. He purified my conscience. He purified my heart. Once for all. I'm free from sin. Jesus' blood isn't a reminder to me of how sinful I am. It's a reminder to me of all the forgiveness he gave me. It's an incredible difference. I'm free from sin. I'm not reminded of sin because of the sacrifice. I'm free from sin because of the sacrifice. Just a few correlations here. I thought I'd put these up here. The writer of Hebrews quotes the Old Testament, I don't know how many times, probably hundreds of times. And I'm not going to read all of these, but just to note them, I did read a few verses that were quoted from Jeremiah. Chapter 8, 9 through 12 is quoted from Jeremiah chapter 31. And that's God talking about the new covenant that he's going to bring and how it's going to be internal versus external. And then there's two times in chapter 10 where the Old Testament is quoted. Where Jesus says, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. That's quoted from Psalm chapter 40. And that's about Jesus bringing the new covenant. So, in a sense, a prophecy. and then the last part of chapter 10, verses 37 and 38. In my Bible, it's put to a different format so that it looks like it's a direct quote, but really it's just a paraphrase of Habakkuk, chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. So just a few interesting notes there. I didn't get to study all those in detail, but those are prophecies in a way that were all fulfilled by Jesus. So just a few more thoughts, a few more, maybe a little more application, something that's more practical to us. So Jesus' sacrifice was infinitely better. It's interesting to look at the picture of the old system, all the sacrifices and the temple and all those things, and how that was a picture of what was to come. But yet, the picture, Jesus was just infinitely better than the picture that was before. And I think I read most of these verses already. Let me just see. Chapters 10, verses 12 through 14. I'll read those verses. It says, "But when Christ had offered for all time," so it's better in that way, "a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down on the right hand of God." So that's significant because when Jesus sat down, it means he was done. His work was done. You don't sit down till your work's done, right? Jesus sat down. There was nothing else for him to do. He had done it all. Because his sacrifice was infinitely better. Let us draw near. Chapter 10, verses 19 through 22. So because Jesus brought a better covenant, and because Jesus is in heaven interceding for us, we are able to draw near. I'm just going to read chapter 10, verses 19 through 22. "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water." In the old system, in the temple, there was that Holy of Holies. Only the high priest could go in there once a year. When Jesus died, the veil split in half. You remember the veil splitting in half? Why was that important? Because guess what? Now we all have access to God. There wasn't just one person. It wasn't just the high priest that had to go in there. We all have access to God because Jesus is in heaven interceding for us. And we don't need to be fearful. There's no fear in drawing near to God anymore. We're not going to get struck dead. Jesus wants us to come to him. We have a clear conscience. We have confidence in the saving power of Jesus' sacrifice. So as in all the other sections, there was a warning. And this section is no different. Verses 26 through 31 approximately give us a very stern warning to not despise Jesus' sacrifice. If in the Old Testament, if you disobeyed or if you did something wrong and you said, you know what, I don't care, you despised the sacrifice that was given, if that guy got punished in the Old Testament, how much more am I going to get punished if I tell Jesus that his blood is no good and I don't need it, right? I'm just going to read verses 26 through 31. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It's a very stern warning to each of us. Do not, just think of the verse in Romans that said, do we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. God forbid. God, Jesus has so much grace to give us. It's so true. He has all we need. But let's not take advantage of it. That totally defeats the purpose. That's not what Jesus didn't come to give us grace so that we can go on sinning. He saved us from the sin. In verse number 4 there, the author of Hebrews offers encouragement. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but he just offers encouragement to the believers. At that time, they were suffering persecution. He gives them encouragement. Maybe a couple verses I'll read here, verses 24 and 25. It says, "Let us consider to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near," probably the day of his return. So, because of this better covenant that we have a better covenant. Jesus brought it. Jesus' blood, right? We're free from sin. We can have a clear conscience. It gives us great encouragement to stir up each other. If I see a brother struggling with something, it's like, buddy, you don't have to be struggling with the sin. Jesus took care of that, right? Let's encourage each other. And then just kind of the last thought I have here is, which leads into the faith chapter. Chapter 10, verse 39 is the last verse before chapter 11, which is the faith chapter, which we'll get into next time. But just at the end here, he talks about living by faith. I'll start at verse 37. It says, "For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." It says, "But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls." So this was this also, while it was encouragement for us to live by faith, it was also a stern warning to those believers to, here's all the proof. Here's all the proof you need that Jesus is better than the old covenant. So why are you shrinking back? Why are you going back to the old covenant? This new covenant is so much better. And I think about living by faith. How many times do I live by other things other than faith? Do I live by practicality? Do I live by, what I can see? Of course, I'm going to make a decision on what's the best thing to do with what I have and what I can see. Or am I truly living by faith? Am I making decisions on what God wants, or just the things that I can see? So, just a challenge for us to live by faith. And I think I did not study that far ahead, but I think maybe I will get into more of that when we look at the next section, especially in chapter 11. So So that's all I have for this section, chapters 8 through 10. Hope some of that made sense to you. I always enjoy studying, and whenever I study the Bible to preach, I don't really study any other time, so when I preach, then I have to study it. And I always learn so much, and it's always fun to bring it to you guys to tell you what I learned. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we can be dismissed. God, thank you for today. Thank you for we can come to your house, worship you together.